All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tuleyome's August Nature in You lecture. My name is Jeff Ben. I am Tuleyome's Education Associate. If you don't know, Tuleyome is a small conservation nonprofit based in Woodland, California. Our mission is to engage in advocacy and active stewardship with diverse communities to conserve, enhance, restore, and enjoy the lands in the region. The region that we focus on is the northern inner coast range and the neighboring areas of the Central Valley. In particular, we focus on the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument, which we led the effort to get established in 2015 and recently helped to lead the effort to expand just last year. In addition to our public lands advocacy work, we also do a variety of education programming, including nature field trips for K-12 classes. We do a really great certified California naturalist course. We have a range of natural history and policy articles in our newsletter. And of course, we have this monthly lecture series. We also run a range of adventures programs, including hikes, trail building days, wildflower tours, and our youth boot bank, which provides free loans of hiking boots to kids. If you'd like to learn more about these or any of our other projects, you can do so at our website, tuleyome.org. All right, on to tonight's lecture. So Tuleyome is supported in part by donations from folks like you. So if you're able to do so and haven't done so already, we greatly appreciate a donation to support all of the good work that we do. For tonight's lecture, we are very lucky to have Roy Arthur Blodgett with us. Roy is a Northern California-based naturalist, writer, and ecological consultant. He is a certified wildlife tracker and also works with Tuleyome on some of our trail construction and trail maintenance projects. And so tonight, he's got a lecture for us on wildlife tracking, which I'm really excited about. And so during the lecture, we ask that you keep yourself on mute, hang on to any questions until the end, and we'll have plenty of time for some Q&A at that point. All right, Roy, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for the invitation to do this tonight, Jeff. I really appreciate it. And I'm delighted for the opportunity to share a little bit about wildlife tracking, which is a longtime passion of mine. So I prepared a slideshow here. I'm going to go ahead and get that going for us. And we'll dive right in. So yeah, this is just meant to be an introduction to wildlife tracking. Wildlife tracking is a profoundly nuanced, complex, layered practice, and it would be impossible to summarize the depth of it in, a single 50-minute lecture. So this is really intended just to be an introduction to kind of wildlife tracking in the Northern Intercoast Range, the North Bay area, which is kind of my stomping grounds here and where I've primarily participated in tracking. So a little bit about me. I'm a naturalist, ecological educator, and wildlife conservation advocate. I have a lifelong passion for biodiversity, in particular appreciation for herpetofauna. They were kind of my original inspiration to get outdoors, was in pursuit of reptiles and amphibians and trying to find all the species native to the North Bay region. But they kind of introduced me to the broader ecological environment and a broader interest in ecology. And along the way, I've kind of developed, a broad kind of generalist stance as a naturalist, and kind of collected some certifications and stuff along the way, including in wildlife tracking, herpetology, and also venomous snake handling, among others. And in addition to that, I'm very passionate about poetry and land stewardship, wilderness rites of passage work, woodworking, and herpetoculture, which is the practice of keeping and breeding reptiles and amphibians. I have a small collection of rare species of reptiles that I work with here at home, and keeping kind of elaborate naturalistic vivaria. So on to tracking. Let's see here if I can get this to go. There we go. So tracking, I like to think of tracking as the art of asking questions. Human beings, with our enormous capacity for pattern recognition are natural trackers. And for our ancestors, it was as natural and normative a daily practice as we think of cooking or gardening. And for myself, I didn't necessarily realize that I was participating in wildlife tracking until many years after it had already been kind of a daily practice of mine. I just didn't think of it as tracking. It was just kind of part of my, nature observation practice and orientation to being outdoors was to pay attention to tracks and to animal sign and all of those things. But I didn't think of it as a subset and discipline of its own until I was introduced to the kind of wildlife tracking community when my partner enrolled me in a tracking and poetry workshop that was facilitated by a dear friend of ours and a very skilled tracker named Sylvia Lindstedt, who's from the Point Reyes region. And that really set in motion this realization, oh, wow, this is something that people do and that they do together and that they get out in the field together. And I want to explore this more. So that led me to the Regenerative Design Institute out of Bolinas, where I enrolled in their tracking program, which was skillfully taught by Scott Davidson and Paul Raphael. And later on joined other tracking groups as well. So very early on in my kind of journey of formal wildlife tracking, I spent a lot of time in the field with others, really skilled senior trackers, learning from them. I'm greatly indebted to them. But again, the foundation of tracking is really about asking questions about what we're observing and thereby determining the who, what, when, where, and why of a given track or set of tracks. So the more questions you can ask about your observations, the more you can scrutinize them with an open mind, the more likely you are to have a rewarding experience from the art of tracking. Seems like there's a tiny bit of a lag here when I go back. There we go. So by asking good questions about the attributes of a given track and the context in which the track is observed, we can sometimes piece together something of a story, or at the very least, the ability to correctly recognize and identify the different tracks of species in one's region. You can have a greater understanding of those species and their habits. And this is particularly valuable for species that are elusive to us that we might not normally see. This is, particularly relevant to predators like bobcats and mountain lions and black bears, these other species that we're less likely to see on a regular basis. This photo here is there's a slight story here in this track of a black bear that had a kind of a slip of the paw as it was climbing over this black oak branch deep in the forest. And it just makes me wonder, why was it even climbing over this branch? And all these questions arise there for me from seeing this one single track or this one single piece of sign in the forest. So how does one go about learning to identify tracks? Let's talk about that. So the first thing I always like to bring about is context. And it's always important to consider the context of where a given track is observed. That being, what is the habitat? What are the species that you might expect to utilize such habitat? Is the area urban or is it rural or are you in a deep wilderness setting? What are the weather conditions? All of these things provide valuable clues to what might be happening, what the species is, and also what it might be doing in the landscape. And this is especially relevant to the substrate conditions. So, has it rained recently? Is there morning dew in the place where these tracks were made? This can also give you some idea of how old the tracks might be because, heavy rain is likely to erase tracks or obscure them. But also, a recent rain and then dry period after will often leave really nice, clearly defined tracks. I like to share these two photos here. These are both tracks from northern raccoon, but under very different substrate conditions. You can see on the left photograph there is this very dry, dusty substrate. This photo was taken recently, actually, here on the road to my house in August. And there's not much moisture in the ground here in August. And obviously, the photo on the right It's this nice wet substrate, and you can see how differently the tracks present. You can see how much more definition there is in those wet tracks, and it even makes the species, um, a little bit more obvious in the right tracks with these long kind of fingers, whereas in the others, because the fingers of this raccoon, the digits of this raccoon aren't um, depressing into the substrate as much, they appear a little bit more truncated. And this is actually a common way that these tracks are misidentified. It just has to do with the substrate conditions. So let's get to our next slide here. So the answers to these questions and others of this ilk will help to narrow down the range of possible species that may have created the track and offer clues to what the behavior of the species at the time the track was left. So this is a photograph again of this is a deer track, and the only reason why it was even visible under these conditions is there was some really nice morning dew in this grass that just minutes before this track was left. And had I come by, 2 hours later, this track would have been totally erased by the evaporation of all that morning dew and the grass springing back into place. All right, so when we're considering track identification, there are various attributes, and we're going to kind of go through several of the different attributes that I like to consider when I'm encountering a new track. And foremost among them, maybe the most obvious one for many of us, is just the size of the track. So the size of a track can quickly help you narrow down the potential species list that you might have that's relevant to this particular track. And I find it really helpful for those of us who are not super familiar with the different size of tracks of various wildlife to consider, our domestic corollaries, so to speak, and consider the size of your dog's tracks, of an average dog or of an average cat track. And that kind of could maybe help you to get an idea of, okay, that's roughly this size animal and it has this size track. That gives you kind of a ballpark estimates in some cases that can be really helpful in narrowing down your potential species. So in this case, we have up in the upper left there is a red fox track. And down in the lower right, kind of center right is a gray fox. These are tracks that I observed up in Glacier National Park a few years ago. And I just love this because these are both, canid family carnivores, very similar actual structure to their tracks, but obviously there's an enormous difference in size between a gray wolf and a red fox, and that's obviously very clearly illustrated in their tracks. Another thing I really like about this photo is you can see in the red fox track, you can actually see the definition of fur in the track. Foxes have these very furry feet, and that's a secondary kind of identifying characteristic there. Another major thing to consider is the proportions of the track. So by that, I mean, how large is the heel pad in the track in proportion to the toes? And one kind of mental exercise I like to do is to kind of imagine how many toes can I fit into the heel pad. If I can fit several toes into the heel pad, you're not looking at a canine or a canid. You're going to be likely looking at something else. And also, I love this as well because it can also help you to understand a little bit about the behavior and the biology of the tracks you're looking at. And throughout this lecture, I'm going to be focusing a lot on the differences between canine and feline, or canid and felid tracks, because these are very often confused for one another. Although there are some very clear distinctions between them once you're more familiar, but um, these animals have very different, behaviors and hunting strategies. And in the case of felids, your wild cats, they're stalking predators. They rely on stealth, a silent, slow approach to getting close proximity before a brief burst of speed or a jump to catch their prey. Whereas canids are they're more strategic, they're more fast, they rely more on their agility and less on stealth in their hunting practices. And this in some ways translates to even how their their foot structure is, and the actual track morphology as well. So canids have these very large toes, very small heels. That's something that you would expect for something that has, it's very forward in its motion. Whereas cats have these very broad heel pads and very small toes in comparison that allows them to stealthily move. And I just love that that's illustrated even in their tracks. Okay, so another thing to consider is the toe count. So counting the number of toes visible in a given track is one of the fastest ways to narrow down the possible species responsible for leaving the track. The majority of mammals in our region are going to be expressing either 4 or 5 toes in the track. Um, but sometimes you'll see other toes that are not visible under certain conditions. Maybe they're only visible under deep substrate conditions, that kind of thing. But familiarizing oneself with the different species in the region and even kind of creating a chart, which is something that I did early on in my tracking journeys. I created a chart of all the different species native to the region I was tracking and how many toes are in each species. So I could then correlate that to their tracks. You can also include other helpful information like habitat preferences, um, general size of the tracks, other things to help you kind of narrow down. But one of the first exercises that I always recommend for people really interested in tracking is to get a good field guide to the mammals of your region. If we're specifically talking about mammal tracking, which is the focus of this lecture, and creating a list of the actual mammal species in your region. In some cases, you might be surprised that there are species that occur in that region that you may not even know are there that are just very elusive, which was the case in my experience. Um, so determining whether or not a track expresses bilateral symmetry is also a really helpful indicator of in determining track identification. And again, this is especially helpful when distinguishing the difference between feline and canine tracks, which again are so frequently confused. So we're going to kind of look at each of these photos and kind of break them down in more depth to kind of unpack the difference that is there between canid and felid tracks. So this is a pretty perfect coyote track that was left in obviously this quickly drying mud. I believe this was in Bodega Dunes in Sonoma County. And you can see here, you can count the toes. This is actually, if we were going by the proper toe count morphology and tracking, these would be numbered differently. But for the sake of just ease, I've just numbered them as we would expect. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 toes, and then a heel pad there, numbered in red. And then here we can see that there's almost just perfect bilateral symmetry in this track. And if you were to fold the track in half, you would have a perfectly symmetrical overlay. Now, if we distinguish that to mountain lion tracks, and I've obviously rotated this photograph to give us the same vertical orientation. And this track is a little bit complicated because there's actually 2 tracks in this photograph, and they're kind of indirectly on top of one another. But you can see here, this is kind of the 1, 2, 3, 4 and heel of the mountain lion track. You can immediately see that there's a huge difference, as I expressed earlier, in the size of the heel in proportion to the toes on this track. If we go back to our coyote, the toes and the heel are honestly similar in size. You could maybe fit 1.5 toes into the heel pad there. Now, if we go back over to our mountain lion, you could fit all of the toes into that heel pad pretty comfortably, it looks like. So there's just a huge difference there in the proportions of the track. So we've got our 1, 2, 3, 4, our heel, and then here's some symmetry. You can see it's asymmetric. It's an asymmetrical track bilaterally. And this second toe, as I've numbered it, is leading. It's ahead of all the others. And so the toes are distributed in kind of an arc, with one toe slightly ahead of all the others. And this is a really excellent indicator of a feline track. whether you're looking at a domestic house cat or a bobcat, or in this case, a puma, a mountain lion. So moving on, another thing that's really helpful to consider with tracks is claw marks. The presence or absence of claw marks can sometimes be a helpful indicator in determining species for a given track. And canids will usually present claw marks, while felids, you think of your house cat, they have these retractable claws, right? So they often won't present claw marks in most cases. That said, there are caveats because in certain substrates like deep mud, you may still see some presentation of claws in felid tracks. And I also had an experience where I was looking at some tracks that I initially assumed were gray fox tracks because they had very obvious claw marks, but upon closer look, I realized that they were bobcat tracks. And the reason why they had these obvious claw marks is because this bobcat was actually jumping from the ground up onto a log, a fallen log. And in that act of jumping, it actually retracted its claws for more traction and left these very clear claw marks in the mud. In the case of this photograph here, we have gray fox tracks, and you can see these just little needle marks, really, of very sharp, tiny claws. And they're actually a bit of a distance away from where you see the toe pads registered. Sometimes people will miss claw marks because they're actually further out from the rest of the track than they might expect because they have these long, sharp little claws in wild critters. And also the relative sharpness or bluntness of claw marks can also be an indicator of whether the tracks were left by a domestic or a wild animal. So this is another area where people very frequently get confused with tracks. Is it a dog or is it a coyote or is it a dog or a wolf? Depending on where you are. In my region, it's mostly trying to determine if it's a dog or a coyote. And one good indicator, there are many that we'll talk about, but one of them is the bluntness or sharpness of the tracks. So if you see on this left track here in that nice mud, that's our coyote track again. And you can see very clear, kind of pretty sharp claw marks on those toes on the front of the track. On the right side, provided the substrate conditions are different, you can see that the toes presented of this domestic dog, which is actually my dog, are very blunt because my dog spends a lot of time walking around in our house on tile and on a concrete slab, and wears down her claws from that. She doesn't keep them as sharp as a wild coyote would that's very regularly burrowing and is actually maintaining the sharpness of their claws as a tool. So another indicator of um, whether or not you're looking at potentially a domestic animal track versus a wild animal track is essentially the muscle tone that's present in the track. And I've heard this referred to by a lot of trackers as whether like the tightness of the track or the sloppiness of the track. And the reality is that um, domestic dogs very frequently they have a lot more negative space in their track than a wild dog would, a coyote would. And if we go back again, look at our coyote track, if you look at the negative space in this coyote track, it's very minimal. It's a very tight, ovoid shaped track. And if we go back to this dog track, it's much more round. There's much more negative space. The toes are far more splayed. And there's a lot less muscle definition in the track itself. That said, it's really important to consider the substrate conditions with this because in mud or very soft substrates, even wild dog tracks, their toes will still splay to gain traction. And so sometimes that can be a bit of a confusing element to look at. So again, I would always encourage folks, if you are kind of like, okay, this looks like it could be either one, again, go back through these questions that we've already kind of presented. Consider the context. If you're in a deep wilderness setting where it's very unlikely that you're going to encounter a dog at all, chances are, you're looking at a coyote track and it's just the substrate conditions, that are causing it to splay a little bit more than it normally would. But sometimes it can be very hard to tell with the information that you have available, which is part of the fun. So I wanted to share just a few other tracks of interesting species in the region before we kind of get to our Q&A section. I think that I'm going through this much faster than I initially anticipated, which I tend to talk fast when I'm a little bit nervous and presenting something, so forgive me for that. But in this case, this is an American Badger track, and this was a fun story for me. I was actually visiting the Carrizo Plain National Monument with some friends, some fellow naturalists, and right as we were entering into the monument, we were talking amongst each other, and this is the first time any of us had been to this place, and we kind of, one of my friends, Lee, asked me, he's like, "Do you think that there are badgers here?" And I was like, "It seems like amazing habitat for them here. I would expect that they would be here." And then not 30 minutes later, we were kind of meandering in this dry creek bed and found these perfect American Badger tracks. And I love these tracks because you can see just how far out from the toes the claw marks present. And that's just badgers are superlative diggers. They're the best diggers in the among North American animals. A badger can start digging and be underground in about 90 seconds. They're just incredible burrowers. And they use these immense long claws to dig. So you can see those just beautifully expressed in this track and this nice fine substrate of the creek bed. And there's actually some other tracks, kind of some rodent tracks actually that are also visible in this photograph, kind of on the right margin there. Probably a deer mouse. I always like to see these tracks. These are striped skunk tracks. And I'm always amazed when I see skunk tracks in good substrate, how similar that they present as bear tracks. Obviously, vastly different size, right? But the actual proportions of the track themselves are very similar to bear tracks. And very, very often people will say, raccoons, they'll refer to raccoons as little bears, and largely due to their ecology. But bears are actually not too distantly related from the mustelid family, from the other carnivores in North America. And I see that expressed in these tracks that really to me look like little bear tracks a lot of the time. Here we have some black-tailed deer tracks alongside raccoon tracks, and somebody's boot heel there as well. And here's a black bear track. And this was an exciting track for me to find. This is actually the first black bear track I observed in Sonoma County, in my home county. I grew up in Santa Rosa, and I spent a lot of time in the backcountry as a kind of a teen and into my 20s looking at tracks. And up until really the last 10 years, black bear tracks in Sonoma County were very infrequently observed. Um, and it was really around the time of the Valley Fire in Lake County. And then subsequent fires, after that, the August Complex Fire up in Mendocino, the Redwood Complex Fire, all these major wildfires that we experienced in the kind of Mendocino National Forest, the Mayacamas. These seem to have influenced movement of black bears throughout the North Bay. That, in addition to the fact that the black bear population is larger now in California than it's ever been, as far as we understand historically. And so black bears are starting to disperse into these kind of more lowland habitats, which formerly would have been occupied by grizzly bears pre, settler colonial period. And so this was a very exciting find for me at the moment, because I was walking around and I was actually having a discussion with a friend on this hike about bears. And we looked down and we were walking right alongside a bear trail and these really nice bear tracks, and kind of gasped. Here we have a fawn track, a small black-tailed deer. And I like this track because you can see that the deer lost traction as it was stepping in this mud, and it kind of slid. And it's right alongside a perfect striped skunk track. Again, that you can see that again that just the proportions are so similar to a bear track. So that's what I have for us tonight. I want to present some resources to encourage folks to take this deeper, because tracking, like as I said, is such a deep skill set. There's so much more to explore. We could talk for days about the different types of tracks of creatures in this region, and also gaits is a huge thing. So actually determining based on how the tracks are presented, we can understand how the animal is moving, and that can give a lot of context and insight into the story of what was happening when the tracks were made. So gaits is another really important thing. And for recommended reading, I strongly recommend Mammal Tracks and Sign by Mark Elbrock. There's also kind of a California Natural History Guides version of this book called A Field Guide to Animal Tracks and Scat of California. That's by Elbrock, Kresge, and Evans. That's another great guide. These books are just there's such an incredible wealth of information in these books, and there's also Elbrock has done companion guides for bird tracks and sign, and even reptile and amphibian tracks and sign, which if you want to get really granular and nerdy about tracking, you can get into the birds and the reptiles as well. That's quite a lot of fun. For kind of a little bit more of the kind of philosophy and practice of tracking, I highly recommend Tracking and the Art of Seeing by Paul Resendez, and The Heart of Tracking by Richard Vaca out of Point Reyes. Richard Vaca also teaches at the Point Reyes Tracking School, which kind of emerged out of the Point Reyes Tracking Club. And I used to kind of head out with those folks sometimes early on in my tracking journey. So highly recommend those folks if you're in the kind of North Bay region and you want to get out in the field with some really, really amazing senior trackers. That's a great place to do it. And then lastly, Cyber Tracker North America. And oftentimes when I say the word Cyber Tracker, people are like, what is that? Well, that sounds like some sort of, you know, internet thing, hacking or something. And that's actually the name of this organization that's existed for many decades. That actually started as a resource for indigenous trackers from Africa and the global other regions of the global majority to become certified in tracking skills to be able to lead people in tracking safaris and hunts and things like that. But it is expanded far beyond that to really be kind of a hub for tracking certifications and learning. So Cyber Tracker offers these tracking certification workshops called evals. That's how I became a certified wildlife tracker, was doing an eval several years ago. But it's something that I recommend for anyone interested in tracking to sign up for a tracking eval, because the intensity of the experience is really profound. You meet at a location that is not given ahead of time. It's given like 12 hours, 24 hours before you're in the fields, and you get out there in the field with a bunch of other people doing the eval and a senior tracker. And basically, the senior tracker goes through and finds track and sign and sets up stations. And then everyone kind of goes through these stations, offers their interpretation and their answer to what's going on. And then after everyone's given their answers, the senior tracker and the whole group go back through the stations and talk about what's happening. And the senior tracker kind of reveals their interpretation of what's occurred. And it's really a remarkable how much you can learn from doing a tracking eval. My first eval, I was stunned by how exhausted I was after the first day. It was a 2-day experience because of just how much mental energy we were all expending in that experience. So I highly recommend it for folks interested in learning more about wildlife tracking. There's no better way to do it than that. So thank you for listening. You can find me online if you're interested in reaching out or sending me an email. My email is royblodgett@gmail.com. My website is royarthurblodgett.com. You can find Some of my poetry, usually kind of ecology focused poetry. And Instagram at Roy Arthur, I share my poetry there as well. Feel free to get in touch if you feel moved. Thank you so much for that. And we'll jump into our Q&A here.
All right. Thank you so much, Roy. Folks have questions. You can either unmute yourself and ask, or you can type the questions into the chat, and I'll be happy to relay them over to Roy. We did have a question in the chat asking if you might be able to go back to the dog and coyote photos and then
Yeah,
like point out where those claws were.
yeah, I can. Let's see. Let me go back to my screen share here. Just one moment. Um, okay, so that should be showing up now. And okay, so part of why the claws aren't super visible in the context of the track on the right in particular, which is the dog track, is because there's kind of a pebble right in the middle of where the claws are presenting, but there's that dark shadow right at the top margin of the claws and those of the toes, I mean. And that's actually the presentation of the claws, the front claws of this dog. Um, Likewise, on the track of the coyote on the left, you can see the claw marks right at the top margin of those top two toes. I'm not sure if my cursor showing up.
It is, yeah.
It is okay. So you can see right there that you've got a nice sharp claw, and then here the kind of blunt margins of the claw marks in the dog. So I hope that's clarifying.
Then we have another question in the chat from Nicholas about snow as a
Yeah,
substrate. How does that affect interpretations? Yeah, can you talk a
snow
little
is
bit about
amazing.
snow?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I don't have a great deal of experience tracking in snow. I've tracked in snow a few times, but we don't get a lot of snow where I live, unfortunately. But I'm often envious of people that do get a lot of snow because it's an amazing substrate for tracking. It often holds definition very, very well. Again, depending on the snow conditions. Um, Sometimes, if you have very slushy snow, it's not as good. Obviously, it's just like any other substrate. It's very variable depending on the conditions of it. And sometimes very deep, powdery snow can be difficult to determine, like the definition in tracks. But a skilled tracker can even understand, even under those like kind of powdery, deep conditions, what species is making the tracks based on the gait, and even the kind of the shape of the margin of the kind of impressions that are made in the snow. There's actually some really great illustrations in the Elbrock guides that I mentioned of just like the arc of the margin you might expect in a snow track for various different species that you would commonly be tracking in snow. So it's an amazing substrate to learn in, and I honestly I wish I had more insight to share there, but it's snow is few and far between where I live, unfortunately. I live at pretty low elevation.
Yeah. So, I'm a wildflower guy, and so I know I often will have kind of rare or weird plants I'm really excited to see in the field. So I'm curious if there are any particular tracks that you've been particularly excited to see because they were rare or unusual, or are there any that you haven't found yet that you're hoping to?
Oh yeah. I mean, I always really love seeing tracks of kind of the smaller species. Like I've observed tracks for long-tailed weasels, for example.
Mm.
out in Point Reyes Peninsula primarily, and also a couple different parks in the North Bay where they're pretty abundant. And those are really fun just because it's such a small animal, and you have to have pretty perfect substrate conditions to even get good impressions of the tracks because they're not very heavy. Or even mouse tracks, things like that. I'm always excited to see. Um, in terms of like what would be a really profound, it would be really profound for me to see wolf tracks in California, given that wolves are returning to the state. I actually the person who led my cyber tracker evaluation was part of a group of trackers that actually tracked the course of OR7, which was the first wolf to come back into California from up north in Oregon. And it was really amazing to hear about his experiences tracking that wolf and seeing its tracks in the field. So again, wolves haven't quite made it to where I live, so I don't expect to see them here, but I'd love to get out into kind of the Lassen, Plumas area and look around and see if I could see some wolf tracks in some of the areas where they're more known to be established packs at this
Hmm.
point.
Hmm.
And then another big one that I really want to see at some point is brown bear tracks, like nice clear brown bear tracks. I saw some at Glacier when I was there, but not in the best substrate conditions. And given my love for bears, I'd love to see brown bear tracks at some point.
Very cool. Yeah. All right. We have any other questions for Roy? While we're letting that percolate a little bit, I'll do a quick plug for next month's lecture. That is going to be fourth Thursday in September, which will be from Brian Gillespie, who's a professor at Woodland Community College, and he's going to be talking about native bees and some research he's been doing on native bees at the Woodland Regional Park Preserve. So I think that should be another interesting talk. And then, of course, if any of you have ideas for folks that might be good speakers or topics you want to hear about,
Yeah.
please send me an email. I am always looking for new speakers and new topics. So don't be shy. All right. So I'm not seeing any more questions. So I
It
think
was
we
just
will.
so thorough.
Also, it's a lot of information. Yeah. Um, All right, so we've got one more question in the chat here. So on
Yeah.
documentaries, often trackers easily follow an animal. What's the role of like vegetation in the area in terms of
Yeah.
vegetation being squished or broken or
Yeah, that's a really great question. So that can be helpful, definitely. And also I should say that there's trailing, which is the art of following tracks essentially to the animal, is its own whole art and discipline. And there's actually separate evals and certifications within like the cyber tracker world for trailing specifically. And it's really incredible to be in the field with someone who's good at trailing because they will notice the most minute differences in the way that substrate or vegetation, even leaf litter, has been impacted by an animal moving over it quickly. And usually, trailing has a lot to do with there's a short time window when trailing is typically really effective because vegetation often does kind of like say if an animal is moving through grass, the grass is eventually going to kind of spring back to its original position, right? Depending on again the weight of the animal. If you're trailing bears, for example, they are so heavy that they will actually crush the grass, and they're a great species to learn trailing from because they're just so massive. But in the case of smaller animals, typically it's quite difficult, and I would say that even observing yourself walking through, other or people walking through grass, you'll notice that if you're it depends on the conditions. Again, there's going to be a big difference between moving through dry grass in summer or fall versus, moister, richer grass and vegetation in spring. Yeah, this is a good
So
question.
yeah.
Yeah, so Chloe asked, apologies if I've been daydreaming and you answered this, but do you have a favorite or memorable moment, particular experience when investigating a track or a surprise track ID? Um, I think again that I kind of spoke to it already about that black bear track, but that was really a profound one because tracking has a way of often tracking can kind of mirror one's internal experience, I've found. Again, as people, we are primed for pattern recognition. And I think that actually the art of and practice of wildlife tracking can help to train our minds to better track in other contexts, like whether they be social settings or our own internal experience, because it's a something that requires sustained attention. And I think that that is something that, especially in the modern world, we're often lacking. So in the case again of the black bear tracks, it was just really a special moment because I was walking with some friends, and we were actually we were all performing that same night at a poetry reading. And I was asking my friends whether or not they thought I should share this essay that I wanted to read to everyone. And the essay is called Escudilla, and it's by Aldo Leopold. It's from his book, The Sand County Almanac, which is an amazing resource. I highly recommend everyone check it out if you haven't already. I imagine many of you have already read it, but that essay is about the killing of the last grizzly bear in the state of Arizona. And it's just an incredibly powerful essay because it ends with now when you look at Escudilla, which was this profound mountain, he says, you no longer think of bear, it's just a mountain now. And there's something about that Leopold was speaking to about how these apex predators, these powerful creatures, contribute so much to the spirit of place. And I think that that's something that I've felt the loss of that in my own encounters of meandering around Northern California, knowing that I'm living in the footprint of where grizzlies once roamed, and knowing that they ought to be here and they're part of this ecology, and the ecology is still recovering from their loss. So we were having this discussion about all of this, and I was saying, is it too bold to just read this essay at this poetry reading that we were going to do? And then we looked down, and literally right at our feet were a pristine set of black bear tracks, and none of us had ever seen bear tracks in Sonoma County before. So we were just kind of like, all right, I guess we're gonna read the essay tonight. So that's probably the one that stands out the most, but there are many. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, that's great. All right. Any other questions for Roy? Yeah, and if
All right.
tracking something you're interested in, in addition to the tracking focus schools, Roy
Mhm.
mentioned, that is something we do a bit of in our Tuleyome Certified California Naturalist course. We get out
Yeah.
and especially some early morning walks and looking at differences between. We did one last year at Wilbur Hot Springs, and there was
Mhm.
a mountain lion track next to a coyote track actually, and so we
Perfect.
got to do that side by side, cat versus dog comparison. And so yeah, I think books are great, but I think it's like you said, it's really great to get out into the field with someone that really knows what they're
Yeah.
talking about. And yeah, it's a great experience.
Yeah, yeah, there's nothing better than that. And I would also say that my relationship to tracking now is really different than when I started, where I was eagerly getting out in the field with a bunch of people. And now a lot of the tracking that I do is just in my day-to-day life. It's walking my dog every morning. we're both tracking and figuring out who was out the night before, on the driveway and on the road. And I've actually seen mountain lion tracks 10 feet from my front door that I would not have expected to see. And so it's become kind of just a way of life for me. It sounds trite to put it that way, but it is just an ingrained daily practice of mine now. That said, yeah, get out in the field with people, or on your own, and just like I said, ask questions. If you can get out with other experienced trackers, that's great. Come out on our trail building excursions if you want sometimes. Well, I'm sure we'll be tracking along the way if I'm out there. So yeah, it's really it's a rich and enjoyable exercise to get involved with. And I hope that I hope that this presentation offered a little bit of a encouragement and a bit of an introduction to diving into that world.
Great. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. So thanks again, Roy. That was a great talk. I enjoyed having you on. And so thanks to everyone who attended. And please be sure to head over to our events page and sign up for our September lecture. All right. Thanks for coming, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday.